Before last month, I had never played BloodBorne. I didn't have a PlayStation, and if I'm being honest, I didn't think the aesthetic or the subject matter would connect with me the way the more medieval fantasy setting of Dark Souls had. I've also never read Lovecraft or Bram Stoker, or really anything that Bloodborne resembles. All of my knowledge about those works is secondhand, and that knowledge is pretty bare bones. But I do know that Lovecraft embraced the notion that the oldest and most primal fear of man is the fear of the unknown. Holy moly. Lovecraft was right. About fear, I mean. In fact, I think he was so intuitively correct that we kind of underestimate the complexity of that statement. The unknown is not an odd thing to fear, but the way we fear it does look pretty odd. What does it really mean to be afraid of the unknown? What is the nature of our fear, and how do we cope?
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood.
Two of the most important characters in Bloodborne are Master Willem and his former protege, Lawrence. They serve a narrative function kind of similar to Gwyn, in that their actions left the world in the state we find it in upon starting the game. Willem and Lawrence led the College of Bergenworth and the Healing Church respectively, and their organizations were at odds in a number of ways. But those ways weren't ideological as much as they were methodological. The college and the church were both dedicated to achieving a kind of evolution or ascendance for mankind. They hoped to achieve the same knowledge, the same insight as the Great Ones. The Great Ones, for anyone who hasn't played Bloodborne, are these eldritch beings who exist transcendentally, at once all around us and yet somehow far away, imperceptible and intangible, but still very real. The existence of the Great Ones is pretty obviously one of the most important things about Bloodborne, not only because they're interesting conceptually, but also because their presence in the story changes the relationship between the inhabitants of Yharnam and whatever unknown they might fear. The fear of something tangible, fire, for example, is easy to wrap your head around and to explain. We know why we fear fire, we know what the consequences would be if our fears came to pass, and because of those facts, we're able to take fairly concrete steps to mitigate the risks of being hurt by fire. In other words, our ability to cope with the fear of fire, and I would argue fear in general, is contingent upon our understanding of it. That's exactly why the fear of the unknown is so vicious and universal. We can't form a coherent relationship to things we don't understand, nor can we do anything about them. The unknown leaves us defenseless. It's not at all an odd thing to fear, but the way we fear it is entirely unique. Because the only way to cope is to look for an answer, ask more questions, dig yourself a deeper grave, in the hopes that you might make sense of things. Even though you know you never will. None of us will. There will always be something we can't make sense of. And that pointless, paradoxical, self-fulfilling hell, that's what it means to fear the unknown. That's the nature of our fear. But it's not the kind of fear we find in Bloodborne. The Great Ones made the unknowable known. They found the answers we were looking for. So maybe we could too. Maybe we could end that hellish loop. As it turns out, the existence of the Great Ones didn't make our fear any less dangerous. In fact, it did just the opposite. Lawrence's decision to distribute the old blood among the people of Yharnam had, quite obviously, horrific consequences. Though at first the blood worked miracles, cured any ailment, any disease, It didn't take long for those who had imbibed the blood to succumb to the scourge of beasts. They lost their humanity and became something else. But I would argue, in the context of this broader conversation about fear, that the process of shedding one's humanity begins the second you embrace the old blood. At the very least, it did for Lawrence. See, it's important to remember that Lawrence's goal was ultimately the same as Master Willem's: evolution, ascension, understanding. The healing miracles were a byproduct of the old blood, but they were never Lawrence's reason for obsessing over it. Both Willem and Lawrence seem to believe, dare I say, understand, that the reason our knowledge is so limited, the reason we live with so much uncertainty, is due in part to our own nature, the limits of our flesh and blood. Take a dog, for example. It may well be able to feel joy and pain, but it can't do complex calculations or evaluate the ethics of its own actions. That kind of understanding is simply outside the limits of its ability. To the Bergenworth scholars, the human mind is much the same. To achieve true insight, our own limitations must be shed. Willem sought to line his brain with eyes, to make visible that which we otherwise can't see. But Lawrence chose instead the old blood, the blood of something other, something incomprehensible, because it knew what he didn't. It knows what we don't. The scourge of beasts may have been an unintended consequence, but Lawrence's actions were always going to result in something other than human. The promise of something other is what drew him to the blood in the first place. Within the world of BloodBorne, the fear of the unknown is more than an endless loop. The unknown can be made known. It has been made known. But only if we give up what we do understand in exchange for what we don't. Understanding the incomprehensible means becoming the incomprehensible. In some sense, this was the only way things ever could have ended. So far, I've largely avoided talking about the specifics of the Great Ones, about what they're doing in the story, what role they have to play. And that isn't just because I'm scared of getting toasted by the lore police. It's also because they confuse the shit out of me. Within the world of BloodBorne, the Great Ones aren't just unknown, they're unknowable. But within the copy of BloodBorne that you bought at Walmart and got your ass kicked in, that's not really true. BloodBorne is a video game, and it was made by people, and it tells a story designed to be interpreted by people. The Great Ones aren't really incomprehensible, they're just supposed to feel incomprehensible. And I think they were mostly successful in that regard. I am, however, very interested in the only concrete motivation we can discern from them. The only thing they're actively chasing that a lot of the story centers on are children. They want children of their own. I've heard a number of different theories as to why that might be, the most common one I think being that they're just trying to reproduce like any species, and setting aside the fact that I think that kind of defeats the purpose of cosmic horror if their motivations can be summed up by, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. I also don't think it matters all that much for the sake of this video. The only thing that does matter is that, for whatever reason, the Great Ones can't have children, or they're fated to lose them, or something along those lines. Again, the specifics of the lore aren't really the point. What is important is that narratively, the Great Ones and humans are really quite similar. Their existences are largely defined by their limits, by what they can't do. The Great Ones want children, but aren't meant to have them. So they seek surrogate mothers among mortal women, among human women. Humans, for their part, are short-sighted and naive. There are things they can't understand, and it drives them mad. It drives them to obsession with the Great Ones. These are both species in despair and in wanting, and because of that despair, they both become fixated on one another. They devote their lives to this sickening envy from which only suffering seems to emerge. Whatever insight the Great Ones obtained, it doesn't seem like it was enough. It didn't free them or save them. It didn't hollow them out or make them empty inside. It didn't seem to grant them what we hoped it would or what we feared it might. So why are we so devoted to knowing it at all? And the answer to that question, I think, is as simple as it is unsatisfying. The Great Ones know something we don't. They know something that Willem and Lawrence didn't know. I'm sure they both wish they had the strength to accept that, to look at the part of them that's human and call it enough. But for better or worse, actually definitely for worse, they didn't. I want to be better, to do better, to come to terms with how much I don't understand, but I'm not even sure it's possible. So I suppose, if nothing else, I can understand them just fine.
I should think you still have dreams. There's nothing more horrific.
Our thirst for blood satiates us, soothes our fears.
Fear the old blood.
By the gods, fear it, Lawrence.